Local programming on KRWG Public Media made possible in part by viewers like you. Thank you.
Hello and welcome to Fronteras, a Changing America. I'm your host, Anthony Moreno. In studio with us is Elaine Hampton. She has a new book that she co-authored with Cynthia Ontiveros about the ASARCO plant. It's titled Copper Stain, ASARCO's Legacy in El Paso. Thank you so much for joining us.
I'm very happy to be here. Thank you, Anthony.
Now, I'd like to kind of start off, for many folks in the area, they may be familiar with the ASARCO plant, the American Smelting and Refinery company in El Paso, because of the large smokestack that used to be in sight for anybody who traveled throughout the borderland. That was demolished, I believe, a few years back. But if you could share with us a little bit, just to start off, why you wanted to write this book. What drove you to write it?
When I was a professor at UTEP in College of Education, and we received a big grant from Environmental Protection Agency. And in that grant, we were trying to get air quality education in the schools, especially the El Paso district. And Cynthia and I had worked together on many projects, and she was administrator in the El Paso district. So we worked together, and we put air quality education in all of the curriculum through the El Paso schools. And the high schools, of course, had to focus on ASARCO, because ASARCO had been such a big polluter in the whole area. Back in the 60s, it was emitting 1,440 plus tons of air pollutants every year.
Wow.
And it decreased from then. But people could smell it in the air, you could feel it in the air, it got in your lungs. So as we were writing that curriculum, apparently the men who had been working at ASARCO during that same time were trying to get some compensation because they were suffering the health effects of it.
So, I mean, you spoke to many former employees of the ASARCO plant here, and I guess to kind of give an understanding to our audience, what exactly, was ASARCO doing? I mean, it was a copper, they were producing copper, is that correct? And also there was a smelting plant for waste as well that was later found out. Can you share with our audience just kind of how big of a employer it was for the region? I mean, it was obviously a source of the economy there locally for around 100 years.
Right. 1880 when it started, just as a rough kind of smelter for lead, since it's such a mining area all over the southwest United States and northern Mexico. And then it grew and grew. It started as a lead smelter first, and then it turned into a copper smelter. As the demand for copper during the war era got bigger and bigger.
And it was also, you worked at UTEP, it also had something to do with UTEP. I know that they provided money and donated land, according to your book, to the university.
It's not even a mile away from UTEP. And so, yes, they donated the land. Many of the engineers that were in the metallurgy, we have a metallurgy department, especially at UTEP for mining, of course, School of Mines, and so it was very closely attached to UTEP. Economically friendly, and not friendly because many of the students were breathing horrible sulfuric acid for many, many years.
Wow. And I just kind of to get an understanding, how many people were really employed by ASARCO during its kind of heyday, would you say?
It varied up and down depending on the price of copper and what all was happening in the production processes. 2000 was a good estimate, about 2000 when it shut down.
Now this was hard and actually dangerous work that was going on there. Can you kind of give us an understanding of what employees there, former employees, were dealing with in regards to the labor part of the production there?
That's one whole chapter in the book. Some of the men called it, they were walking in a field of landmines. And I can account one of the stories that's particularly, well, several stories, people being covered up with, it was molten copper and molten slag. Both are lava. So men were drowned in the lava on a few times. Horrible accidents, falling off of high places. And there was one of the huge machines was called a roaster, like a coffee roaster, but like 4 stories tall. And he went in to fix something in the bottom of the roaster when it was shut down, and somebody turned it on. And so that was just one of the many horrible accidents that happened there. They lived in danger.
So with the process of this, I mean, your book's really interesting because it kind of starts off talking about the history of the mining in the area, but also like the process of what it takes to have copper and smelt the copper. Can you kind of explain a little bit about that, kind of the process of it?
Yeah, that's part of the heart of the theme, is that we love copper, but we need to know the cost of copper. So to dig it out of the ground, 1 ton of copper is 350 tons of dirt, plus 150 tons of tailings. That's just digging it out of the ground. And then you ship it to a smelter. And then it goes through many processes. Can you imagine melting rock hot enough so that the copper would rise to the top and the leftover products, the slag, would ooze out the bottom. Meanwhile, the men are just a few feet away from these huge smelters, and they're managing the lava coming out of the bottom and the copper coming out of the top, and then they send it to another process, kind of a smelting process, or roaster, they would call it, or a furnace, and it went on down the line until it comes out as an ingot, a large ingot, and then they ship those ingots off to make into wire, bullets, and whatever else we need.
Now, there were stories in your book about the employees that worked there during that process, who trying to get the metal out of the lava of some sort, of what it's basically described as, is they had to wear at the time, like 2 layers of long johns and cover their face full of wet towels almost. Is that kind of what they had to do to protect themselves?
Right. Depending on where you were and what protective gear you had, which was never enough, yes, you would, the lava, the molten slag and or copper would come out these big chutes, and someone had to be right on top of those chutes to make sure as it cooled that it would continue flowing, and so the heat would come off of that. And so there were some men who would just wrap their faces in wet towels and every few minutes go and replace the towels. And one man decided he didn't need to, and he ended up being highly blistered.
Wow.
Pretty bad shape.
Now, when the ASARCO plant, the smelter opened, the United States was a different place. It was highly industrial. We're talking about many factories, many industries up and running, but also having a lot of power as far as politically speaking, I should say. How did that really impact the working conditions from the start of this plant which continued basically almost until it closed? Can you kind of give us a timeline of what labor conditions were at the plant?
Right. From 1880 to 1970, basically whatever the men could find to wear to work, however they could protect themselves, they were on their own. And in about the 1970s, we became conscious of the environmental consequences of a lot of our industrial practices. And even after that time, industry still had the power to dominate what happened. But actually, President Nixon signed the EPA, and from then on, there started being regulations. And ASARCO slowly implemented some of those regulations. But as the stories in the book tell, you can see that it was far from as good as it should have been, and still danger.
Now, one thing that also caught my eye reading this book was that there was more than just copper being smelted at this place. There was also waste, hazardous waste being taken to that plant from, I believe it was Houston, which was reported. Can you kind of share news about this and really how it was discovered? Because a lot of folks, according to your book, weren't aware of this happening.
Right. 1999, nobody realized this. Around 1998, and a school teacher, Heather McMurray, found a document from EPA talking about the industrial waste that was burned at ASARCO. And she researched deeper and got permission to get that information and shared it publicly. And then the city of El Paso and the community became aware of all these official documents proving the fact, or citing all the references to the fact that El Paso was burning dangerous, illegal waste from a waste management plant that was also a ASARCO plant in Corpus Christi, Texas. And then there was a whistleblower at that plant that documented, and that document is still online, documented exactly what he saw there, that waste would come in from other places all across the nation, including an arsenal in Denver that had chemical waste, sarin gas, war chemicals, and they would load the waste products of that onto trains, send it to Corpus Christi to be treated. But Corpus Christi, according to the whistleblower, would just bag it up and ship it to El Paso, to another smelter in Montana, and to some smelters in Mexico and China. And wow. The men will actually describe how all of a sudden the waste stream looked very different. Usually they could put it on a conveyor belt and it would go up. And now it was a different looking thing. It would fall off of the conveyor belt onto the stainless steel wheels and would actually erode those. And so the whole system had to change. And they would just end up throwing it right into the smelter.
So they were handling this waste. Did they know what they were handling at the time?
That's one of the real complaints, that there were usually every kind of product that you treat, you have a big sheet from OSHA that explains exactly what that product is, how it'll affect your body, and the kinds of gear and equipment and processes that you need to use to make it safe. And none of that came. Through those 5 years, 92 to 97, there was no documentation about this happening, and no one at ASARCO that we knew that it was happening. And everybody from the management on down was told that we're just recycling the copper out of this product.
Wow. So what happened with that? I mean, what type of action was taken to really stop the hazardous waste from being produced?
There was some lawsuits, and as the over 1,000 places like this across the nation today, they were moved into Superfund site, so that because the company didn't have to do any cleanup. The company went bankrupt, sold out, left. There's only 3 ASARCO sites in El Paso, and they're owned by a completely different company now.
Was that due to the lawsuits, or?
Just because they wanted to avoid having to pay any kind of fees. Lawsuits were minimal, and they took forever, and they bounced around from agency to agency. In the end, there was a lawsuit against the entire ASARCO association in the United States, which was many, many industries. And it was a little over $1 billion. And El Paso got just a little bit of that money, but the men got nothing.
I would imagine a chunk of that money, and you talked about this a little bit in your book, went to just strictly clean up or taking down that facility. So, I mean, if there's just a little bit of money given to the city, how much money is really left after a bulk of that is just going to taking down that plant?
There were other funds for cleanup as they sold what was found. They even found a chunk of gold buried, so they sold that. So it helped. There's a good man who's in charge of the cleanup, although who knows, the men would tell about PCB oils being drained right onto the ground and seeping into the ground. And the process for cleaning that up would be very complicated. So it is almost finished with the cleanup, and it will be at a better state and apparently a usable state. But many people are afraid still.
So what about the former employees? I mean, in your book, it's like generations of folks worked at the ASARCO smelter. You have like people talking to you about like stepping into a legacy that their fathers and their grandfathers took part in El Paso. There was even a community there at one time at the ASARCO plant. Can you share a little bit about that?
There's this strange phenomena that happens whenever you build an ownership or with your team, like a football team, or in this case, it was a smelter. It can be the coal mines. People get behind the place where they work and become advocates for that, and they were all the way through. until the men who were now getting very sick found out about this illegal processes that were happening. And then quite a few of them joined with community activism to prevent it from reopening, because it did want to reopen.
Yeah, there was a group that wanted to come back in and start up operations again. Could you share a little bit about the history of that, and what happened and what prevented it?
Yeah, it had been shut down for 6 years. So can you imagine those huge machines all rusting, sitting there with nothing going on? And then all of a sudden the price of copper goes up. And so the ASARCO company was petitioning the state of Texas for permit to release toxins into the air. Any industry has to have this state-approved permit. And the state of Texas has a process that almost any industry will receive that permit with almost no problems. Well, one of the men who contributed a lot to the book, Daniel Ariano, worked with a lot of community organizations. Senator Shapley from El Paso, many people, many students from UTEP, a group from El Paso, a group from Ciudad Juarez, Sierra Club, many people joined together to say, we do not want this thing to open up again. We've even grown bigger. You know, Ciudad Juarez is just across the river, yards away from this smelter. So within a 5-mile radius, the smelter gases would go into El Paso, Ciudad Juarez, the university.
So let's talk about that as well. Can you share with us what toxins were in the air, in the community, going to, both sides of the border and affecting communities, not only in El Paso, but Juarez as well?
Arsenic, cadmium, lead, copper gases, sulfur dioxide, and I'm missing one. But those, especially the lead, which was going strong up until 1970. And it went into Ciudad Juarez and into that community you mentioned, which was called Smelter Town. And a few of the people who've been here a long time will remember that very small community right under the stacks between the smelter and the river. So just a very small community. And one part in the book, we interviewed a couple named Ben Ontiveros and his wife, Mary. And we were talking to Ben, who had worked for decades at the plant, and he said, let me have Mary talk to you, because they grew up in Smelter Town. And Mary came in and sat with us at the table and kind of drew a map in her mind on the table, and she described 36 people that lived in the same community that had died of cancer.
Wow.
Because they lived right in Smelter Town, and the lead landed right on Smelter Town, in the schools, in the water. Many of the children have ADHD, because lead affects the children that way, lead poisoning.
Now, what other sorts of diseases do folks say that they believe that they may have, gotten due to working here at living at the Smelter Town, working at this plant? I know there was even concern of, the workers, people in contact with the workers who had the dust and the chemicals on them as well.
Yeah, the book is not called an epidemiology, where we cannot prove that someone who was exposed to this kind of thing has this disease. Except with lead, you can see that the children who had lead levels measured in their blood had ADHD. And with mesothelioma, which is the asbestos disease that gets in your lung, so a few of those we can document. But the strange diseases that they had with their bones and with their nerves and heart attacks and cancers. We do have a list of 91 people that we know of who had passed away recently. And we don't have all of 70 of those people, we have the cause of their illness, and at least 25%, 30%, no, I think it's closer to 40% died of a cancer. And then some 20% died of a heart disease, which are very much, part of the book also talks about the exposure to cadmium and lead and copper and sulfur dioxide, and how those kinds of things will affect the body, and it's similar to what those studies show.
So with this, was there any compensation given to these former employees or folks who say they are suffering now due to the ASARCO plant?
So all the men left in 1999, they closed for care and maintenance. That just meant that they shut the plant down with 12 employees, So it was still open, they wouldn't have to do the environmental cleanup. So at that time, whenever they officially shut down later on, the men received a retirement, and teachers' retirements were in the $2,000 a month, and these men were receiving about $400 a month. So the retirement was very small. A few of them had bought into an insurance policy, and so that was helping out, but most of them, there was no continual insurance after the company shut down. If you were old enough to get Medicare, you could do Medicare. A few of them had military, but none of them had their own insurances, so.
Wow.
Or very few did.
So I know you mentioned community activists have stepped forward, former employees have stepped forward, but they've also sought the help of local politicians in the area. Mm-hmm. You've mentioned some former employees wanting to meet with former El Paso Congressman Beto O'Rourke, who is now a Democratic presidential candidate. Could you share a little bit about that meeting and what came about from it?
Yeah, as soon as the men and the community became aware of it, and the men were getting sick, they rallied together in small groups to ask everybody that they can ask for, can we have some compensation? So this is a local problem, but it's also a national, global problem. As all of the industries across our nation, what kind of compensation do they provide for the workers who have left those industries? And what kind of funds do we have as a government or society that would help those folks out? So these men have fought on and on and on, and they're continually working with new Veronica Escobar now. They have her hoping to get a congressional hearing to help them out. But in Beto O'Rourke's office was responsive. There was the environmental program officer under Beto O'Rourke named Diem Ha, listened to the men and could not find any kind of help to compensate them. But she knew that Cynthia and I were working on this air quality program in the schools. So she called us up and said, why don't you just interview these men and at least tell their stories? And that's how it all started. We interviewed Danny Arellano and Carlos Rodriguez, who provided tons of information, and we were spellbound by their stories. And so that's how the book all started.
Well, that is something. When you read this book and you read these stories, many of these stories are happening in the 1980s and 90s. You know, after the Environmental Protection Agency has already been established, after environmental laws have been strengthened, and this was still happening. I mean, your book describes that the workers weren't even given proper clothing to protect them from the heat, to shield them from the heat, until the 90s.
Right.
Very surprising to hear. And I'm kind of curious, you know, so far with what are the people that you are in touch with who are former employees, how frustrated are they that no action has been taken to compensate them? Because these are employees who worked very hard work, important work to their community. And so far, there hasn't been any legislative action taken for them to stand up for them, to help them out, and they're suffering, and nobody has so far compensated them as well. And even after this, there's been, you know, steps taken to start operations back up. So I'd like to hear kind of from you, how frustrated are the folks who are working in El Paso?
There's a spectrum of frustration. There are a few who are extremely frustrated and will continue their advocacy at their own cost, doing everything that they can. And there are a few who are still very proud of their work at ASARCO and don't feel like they have their health issues are related to that. And they have that right. They defend ASARCO. They still will meet together and talk about their experiences at ASARCO, have reunions. And then there are those who have no opinions one way or the other and just are accepting the fact that those diseases, which the men are in their 60s, 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s now. And so what is the disease attributed to?
And many of these, in their 60s, 70s, and 80s, this is something that a lot of employees didn't reach.
Right.
Their lives ended early.
Right.
Which some may say was due to the work of this.
That's right. You know, there were, and Carlos Rodriguez, who worked there at the time, said that he noticed, especially around the time that in the 92, 90 to 97 time, that they were having more and more funerals, and his brother died at that time of colon cancer too, just out of the blue. And he said, we were always doing tamales, give them some tamales and, to the family for the funerals. And he said, it just was more intense during those years.
Okay, we don't have much time left, but I'd like to hear from you, after speaking with everybody who's worked here, understanding the history and culture of the time of people taking pride in their work here at the factory. Because, let's face it, those were good wages at the time that they could find at this factory. In the generations, obviously, so you have a connection there to a legacy of hard work and decent salaries. And you mentioned the spectrum of employees there, but I'd like to hear from you, what does this say about how we treat employees in the United States of America doing difficult work that could be affecting not only themselves, but the environment?
My co-author, Cynthia, did quite a bit of research into the racial issues about environmental waste and environmental hazardous settings. And it is evident, there's documentation in the book, that there are more places that have environmental waste and environmental hazards located in low-income and minority communities.
Unfortunately, we are running out of time. We are out of time. But I do want to thank you so much, Elaine Hampton, for being here. The book is called Copper Stain, ASARCO's Legacy in El Paso, if you want to check it out. And it is a great read, a fascinating read, but also a captivating read when you read these stories of the former employees, people living here in the borderland in that book. Thank you so much for your contribution.
It's a great honor to be here. Thank you.
And we want to thank you for joining us for Fronteras at Changing America. I'm Anthony Moreno.